Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kalina from Business Review Webinars. It is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Boat, Managing Director at Distill Communications, who will moderate today's session. Andrew, over to you.
Hello, I'm Andrew. I'm delighted to welcome you to what is guaranteed to be a fascinating session which explores optimizing labeling processes. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you received via email to rejoin the session. In order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen and click submit. We will allocate some time at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts that you may have, and on an anonymous basis. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. I'm delighted to be joined today by Rhys Evans, Senior Director, CTS and Global Supply at RxSource, and Steve Ellison, VP of Global Clinical Trials at Prism ID. Prism ID is a leading provider of regulated content and label management solutions, and it announced in December that global clinical trial supply specialist RxSource has invested in the innovative Prism 360 clinical labeling platform. The software enables RxSource to optimize its demand-led secondary packaging and labeling services and to supply medicines faster. RxSource specializes in the ethical sourcing, packaging, and delivery of medicines for clinical trials and research and development. They are now able to design and create labels in-house using the cloud-based Prism 360 clinical trials labeling solution from Prism ID. I'm sure we're going to learn a great deal from today's discussions, and we've asked the speakers to explore 4 areas. The first area is how to be validation ready with a cloud-based labeling platform. Where can we mitigate complexity and risk in clinical labeling in an in-house situation and ensure full compliance? How we can deliver shorter lead times of drug delivery by streamlining and automating. And finally, the importance of building up a library of approved language translations and the application of regulatory rules. So Rhys, I wonder if you could start by explaining more about RxSource and the ways in which you see the clinical landscape changing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. So RxSource is a clinical service provider. We specialize in working with small to mid-sized pharma companies and CROs, and we offer them a tailored solution to manage their clinical supply chain through our sourcing services, secondary packaging, and logistics. We've been in business for around 16 years or so, but really, like everyone, 2020 was a year like no other. It was a year where businesses, if they didn't adapt, they were at risk, and even those that did adapt faced challenges that they'd never seen before. It felt like overnight, we were receiving requests regularly for PPE, and lines that we used to have really good access to that had suddenly gone on shortage. Products such as propofol, cisatracurium, dexamethasone, etc., all treatments associated with COVID. We also saw huge hikes in drug prices such as hydroxychloroquine. And even now, we're still experiencing a lot of the shortages associated with COVID, things like needles and syringes. Obviously, working in clinical trials as well, this had a big impact on patient recruitment. Patients didn't want to go into the clinics. They didn't want to be part of clinical trials. So there was an estimated 30% of clinical trials being placed on hold. But for some of those smaller biotechs as well, they cannot afford to postpone their trials. They're reliant on the next round of funding and the data they get back. So there needed to be medicine supplied extremely quickly to those patients that are on those trials to enable those biotechs to get to the next round of funding. And labeling and packaging is really often an afterthought in the supply chain. So when you add into that the complexities of making changes during the study, it meant that all of the clinical services providers, such as RxSource, needed to really be able to adapt to the current environment and offer additional services, things like direct-to-patient services. However, I think really throughout the last year or so, there has been some good that has come out of the pandemic with regards to clinical trials. It's really pushed the industry into the limelight. We regularly see updates on the news about COVID vaccines and the transportation of vaccines. And I think what that has really done is it's meant that sponsor companies are no longer going to accept a normal of 5 to 10 years to get a product from molecule to market when it was achieved within 6 months for COVID vaccines. So there's a bit of a revolution coming. And I think really this growing revolution in the supply chain has been building for maybe 5 or 6 years, and COVID has really sped this up. Patient centricity, and rightly so, is now the forefront of the sponsor and the service provider's mindset. And the ability to offer things like adaptive clinical trials, where clinical trials are changed as they're progressing to consider additional doses or additional recruitment. This is now becoming the normal rather than the exception. So this has meant that service providers such as ourselves have had to really take a look at all of our processes and say, are we as efficient as we can be? Is our process optimized as much as it possibly can be, particularly when it comes to the packaging and labeling services that we're offering? So for us at RxSource, in 2020, we took a look at our services and what we're providing, and we decided that we really need to make a couple of changes to offer a truly adaptive service. So where we were at the start of 2020, we were completely reliant on external providers for label design and label printing. And while those label providers did an absolutely brilliant job for us, it resulted in about 2 to 3 weeks additional lead time for the whole packaging and labeling process. And obviously comes with an additional cost element as well when using a third-party supplier. So the additional requirements as well, if we were trying to adapt to a clinical trial and had to make changes to the label, it would often mean further delay, and at times we would see hundreds, if not thousands, of labels wasted. Also, RxSource has 3 sites throughout the world, Canada, US, and Ireland. And because we were using a third party, we were not harmonized at all in our labeling process. As I mentioned earlier as well, a large number of our customers are new biotech, so they need to get their data as quickly as possible to get the next round of funding into the next clinical trial phase. So it's not acceptable really for them to have any delays in the supply chain, and they're working against a very strict budget. So we looked internally and said, well, really, where can we improve all of our processes without having to compromise on that quality, offer our customers faster service and a cheaper service? And the clear answer for us was to bring labeling in-house. So once we made that decision, we began assessing various software options. And really, it was important for us to determine a company that would enable us to push the boundaries of label design and optimize our internal processes, such as pick and pack for dispatch. We started assessing various service providers, but as soon as I spoke to Steve at Prism, and he explained what they were doing with the software, I could really see that they had a lot of the same core values that we do in approaching the whole labeling process from a patient-centric mindset. So we went ahead with the Prism software, and the fact that it was a SaaS version of the Prism 360 solution being web-based meant implementation and training could all be done remotely, which, as you can imagine, in the grips of a pandemic, this was extremely important. The majority of our staff working from home, and we were only working with the core operational team at our facilities. So if a company couldn't offer a remote setup and remote training, then that wasn't going to work for us. Furthermore, with it being a cloud-based system as well, it's enabled one person to take full control of the labeling process across all 3 of our facilities. However, just after agreeing to move forward with Prism, as these things happen, we provided them with a challenge. Our customer approached us and they needed to have packaging and labeling conducted they could only send us material around the 20th of November, but being a small biotech, they needed to start patient recruitment still within 2020. So they gave us a deadline at the end of November to actually have that material packed, released, and available for dispatch. It was also a US-based study, so we had the consideration of Thanksgiving in there as well. So we spoke to PRISM. This was probably about 5 weeks or so before the 20th, and explained the situation, and we looked at ways in which we could implement that system as quickly as possible, and we were successful in conducting all of the training, the validation and release ready to be able to print those labels and meet the customer's deadline. And what it's done, implementing this software, is enabled us to change this traditional packaging model that we offer. This model is seen widely throughout the industry, where an IMP or a comparator product is provided to a service provider. They then design the label and the packaging to fit accordingly, package and label it, quality release it, and store it until it's been ordered. As I mentioned before, we were completely reliant on external parties to get those out for us. So this whole process took somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks, which is still fairly fast in the industry. However, by optimizing the process and bringing the label design and label printing in-house, we were able to reduce that to 1 to 2 weeks. So we were able to meet our customers' requirements, deliver by the end of November. Now we're only reliant on external parties for booklet labels, but as I'll mention later, there is a technology that could be used in the future, I believe, that will revolutionize translations and booklet labels and mean that we wouldn't be entirely reliant on those vendors. This model is really suitable, very good model for traditional studies that they're not going to adapt during the study, very straightforward, and products that have a long shelf life. So it could be very flexible. You could package once for the full length of the study, and you would be able to deliver that product and not need to do things like shelf life extension. However, as we see the industry becoming more adaptive, more challenges put in front of us, particularly in COVID, we need a different model to be able to adapt to the ever-changing clinical trial landscape. So we now offer a demand-led approach at RxSource. This is also known in the industry as just-in-time or on-demand. And essentially, we leave the product unlabeled, ready for packaging at our warehouse. We design the labels, we get them approved by the customer, we've got the cartons in stock, but we don't actually conduct the packaging until the product is ordered, at which point we package, label, quality release, and distribute to clinical sites. And this is done within 48 hours as standard. What this allows our customers to experience is a massive reduction in waste in the clinical trial, because we're not packaging until the point of dispatch. So in other words, we are packing specifically for a patient need. At this point, we can add a patient number if required. This is something that we couldn't do before. We remove the need to load the clinical sites with stock, which is beneficial to the clinical sites because they often have limited storage. But also, there's not the risk of having to load the sites with stock and then potentially not recruiting. And we work with a lot of customers that work in the oncology field, and more so we're seeing comparators and co-meds being PD-1 inhibitors such as Keytruda and Opdivo, and they come with a cost of thousands and thousands of dollars. So every time we can save them having to buy an overage of that material, that's making significant cost savings to our customers. Additionally, because we're packing at the point of dispatch, we're getting the best possible expiry date applied during the labeling. This is significantly reducing the need to shelf life extend, particularly as we're packing specifically for a patient. So we know that that's going to be used before the drug expires. And this is really beneficial as well for the smaller biotechs that we work with that have very limited stability. Often their stability is only 6 months or so. The need to shelf life extend comes with a huge cost. If we consider a phase 3 clinical trial with hundreds of clinical sites, Having to produce all of those labels, the instructions, mail them to the clinical sites, having the clinical sites conduct the actual activity and then return the completed forms to, say, RxSource, that comes with a lot of time and a lot of cost, as the clinical sites will charge for that work as well. So we see cost upwards of $100,000 for one shelf life extension activity in a phase 3 trial. This would completely eradicate that. Furthermore, as well, it offers the flexibility of applying a protocol number at the point of dispatch as well. So, for example, if an IMP, COMED, or comparator is being shared across multiple different clinical trials, then it removes the need to have to forecast what clinical trial will need how much material. It means that if we were to use the traditional model, then we would potentially package and then have to delabel and relabel if one study recruited better than another. So again, it maintains that flexibility and really helps manage stock. Furthermore, we've seen an additional benefit in our sourcing. RxSource has got a long history of sourcing products for clinical trial use. We offer traditional sourcing, which is where we look for a product throughout the world from our various suppliers, and we bring that product into one of our facilities to potentially label and then distribute to a clinical site. We consider things such as cost, whether we go directly to the manufacturer, availability of product, and robustness of the supply chain. But more recently, we've also started offering local sourcing, where we would buy a product within a specific country for use within that country. The huge benefit of this being that we know the drug meets all of the regulatory requirements for within that country, and obviously it's in the local language as well, so there's not the need to have to translate stock. So how we offer that is, taking China, for example, we source from a local China supplier, we return that to RxSource for clinical labeling, and then we deliver to the clinical site in China. Unfortunately, RxSource doesn't have a facility within China, so this means that we return the stock to, say, Canada for labeling. And of course, this means that it comes with 2 customs inspections, one into Canada and one into China. And for the audience, I'm sure many of you know, the importation into China is a challenge. It comes with additional documentation that's required, and often manufacturers are not forthcoming in providing that documentation. So this meant actually we were losing a bit of business from not being able to import back into China. Furthermore, if you consider the logistics cost of shipping halfway across the world to Canada and then back again, we're talking easily in excess of $5,000 with a 2 to 3 week lead time. And of course, there's always risk when shipping across the world. So we looked at this model and we thought there's got to be a way to improve this as well using our labeling software. And what we found is we can source locally in China, as we have been doing. We can send the product to a third-party logistics provider that we use based in China, fully approved on our quality management system. And then using our PRISM software and the fact that it's cloud-based, we can send them all of the labels so they're able to print and they can conduct the packaging and labeling on our behalf, and then they can deliver to the clinical site in China. And this has meant that the product never leaves China, and obviously comes with a significant cost and time saver. And this isn't only true for China, but for other markets as well, where we offer local sourcing. So it's actually changed our sourcing setup in terms of the local sourcing option that we provide. Randomization as well is key in clinical trials for blinding, maintaining the blind. And when you work with a label provider, they take control usually of what is required in the randomization list. So that was one thing that we said we needed to do is bring that randomization control in-house. Unfortunately, you could say we probably weren't entirely flexible when it came to the requirements for what to include on a randomization list previously. So we would always need a CSV file We would always stipulate that the subject ID was in column A, etc. So there was a lot of back and forth with statistical groups that created those randomization lists. And of course, this back and forth led to additional time taken in the setup of the study. And if at any stage during the study, we needed a new randomization list, often this would lead to the negotiation back and forth again and could often lead to delays. So as I said, we needed to really bring this in-house and take full control over it. The one thing that we didn't see as a benefit for PRISM until we actually went through the training and we didn't think about fully was how easy it is to control the different fields within the randomization list. So we can import very quickly and make very easy changes to the format of the randomization list, how it's imported into PRISM. So for example, if the statistical group provide us list and pack number is used instead of kit number and it's in row B instead of row A, the ability to map using the PRISM software means that isn't an issue to us, and we can still call it pack number or kit number or whatever we wish to call it and have that appear on the label. So this offers us extreme flexibility and it's very fast and very controlled as well when it comes to importing these randomization lists into PRISM. It means also is a very quick and easy process to add a second or a third randomization list into PRISM. And furthermore, if there are any changes to the format during the study, again, it's very quick for us to adapt. Once the list is then actually in the system, it's extremely easy to select how many labels to print. For example, the number of vials per pack. If we're looking at a 5-vial kit, then we can print 5 vial labels all with the same kit number and then a corresponding carton label. And the PRISM system has this embedded safety net, I suppose, which says if we try and select a kit number that's already been printed before. Obviously, we have our own internal processes to prevent that, but it's a neat little feature that has enabled us to have an additional safety net. I think if we look at barcoding as well in clinical trials, this really is an exciting field for me. And at RxSource, we're very, very passionate about patient centricity, and this is where I think there can be a huge difference in patient centricity. The industry is now widely using barcodes, especially since the introduction of the Falsified Medicines Directive, where all commercial material manufactured within the EU needs to contain a unique barcode to ensure that the product's not counterfeit. And more so, GS1 barcodes are starting to be very commonly used to embed variable information into the specific kit on a label. And this sort of information would include batch number, protocol, kit number, etc. And for us at RxSource, having the ability to read these kit numbers using a barcode scanner like the one in the picture there means that we're not having to rely on people, the human element when it comes to hand picking. If you imagine picking bulk orders or orders out of a refrigerator, for example, this really speeds up the efficiency, and it means that the operator doesn't have to stand in the refrigerator as long. So we've seen huge efficiencies with this already at RxSource. And I really feel that GS1 labeling is becoming the new standard, and I really wouldn't be surprised if it becomes mandatory in the foreseeable future. Steve, do you have any thoughts on this? Do you agree?
Well, absolutely, yes. Myself personally, I'm very excited to see GS1 adopted or being used in the clinical trial space. Its adoption has been supported by the efforts of several large, well-known companies. So it's not a single company asking for this use of barcode. This is a joint effort from the industry. And the companies who sort of got together with GS1 to come up with this usage for GS1 include the likes of Sanofi, Pfizer, Ipsen, Thermo Fisher, Almac, Parexel, etc. And they've actually understand how the barcode should be used in the clinical trial space and brought together their knowledge, their requirements, along with the GS1 team, and come up with a set of guidelines. And we've seen something similar a few years ago in the medical device space. They were using the older HIBIC barcodes and some sort of general barcoding. And then they adopted GS1 to fitted their requirements. Now GS1 standard in medical device is universal. So I know GS1 is not mandatory yet in clinical trials, but it will be there very shortly. And we're seeing, from our perspective, more and more of our customers asking, can Prism do GS1 standards? But more importantly, can we also support the 2 application identifiers of 7240, which is the protocol number, and 8006, which is the component item number. So I suggest to the audience that if you are interested in doing GS1 barcodes, check if your software supports 7240 and 8006 AIs, because they are ones we're going to see more and more of in this clinical trial space. So I hope that answers your question, Rhys.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and I think QR codes as well, there's huge excitement from my point of view there. Obviously, we see QR codes all the time used regularly in other industries. And as a result, I think there's the potential to start using QR codes within our industry as well. So talking earlier about booklet labels and the cost to produce booklet labels and the fact that they take around 3 weeks or so, I see the future where we can embed a QR code on the clinical label. It could be an English label, but the patient's able to scan that QR code with their smartphone and pull up whatever translated text that they wish, so they can read the patient instructions there. I think, taking it back further to the patient centricity piece as well, the last thing a patient needs when being part of a clinical trial is to be confused by the clinical trial label. So I think we could use these QR codes to add additional instructions to help them. Things like, you take this pill at this time, this pill at this time, to ensure that patients maintain that compliance with the study and don't inadvertently mix up their dosing and then as a result have to drop out of the trial. And there's also additional trials being conducted using smart labels to control shelf life as well. So once this is past the regulators and approved, we could see the end of the need to shelf life extend, which, as I touched on earlier, is a huge cost saving. So obviously everything needs to be approved by the regulators first. But again, a really exciting opportunity. Don't you think, Steve?
Yeah, again, QR codes to me are more sort of wider ranging than the GS1. GS1 has a function, whereas the QR code is really open to those blue sky thinking companies out there. So how can they use the QR code to really accentuate the patient centricity, the patient experience, real-time feedback of information, etc. And we're involved in some very exciting elements of how the QR can be leveraged to give that customer, the patient, the clinician, access to additional information real-time to really assist what's taking place in the field there. Some high-end stuff we're working with really excites me, and I've seen one sort of use of it where the QR code is used to really blow the customer's mind. For example, that the customer will hold the vial or the bottle, use their phone to scan the QR code, and real time that QR code will do a lookup and then superimpose over that actual image of the person holding the bottle in their hand a revised label showing the text in a different language, or read the text out to it. So this is an area of technology which really is going to be, I believe, develop a lot over the coming years in terms of taking the process of clinical trials and really accentuating it to a point that it's going to be just awesome. Really is. So this is good stuff. Really is. Sorry, I get too excited on QR codes.
No, I think awesome is the word for it. I think there's really so much potential there, even from a clinician's point of view, having the ability to scan the QR code and maybe access the SMPC could be hugely beneficial as well. From our point of view, and thinking again about COVID, we've introduced a direct-to-patient service offering to really try and improve patient centricity. Obviously, patients don't want to go into the clinic or into the pharmacies to pick up their medicines when there's a risk of infection. But with GDPR guidelines local country guidelines, we're quite limited on what we could do. So we're reliant on third parties to manage that direct-to-patient service. But I think, utilizing these barcodes that are available to us could really start to change this as well. Maybe look at it in a way that we can control the blind using randomization. Potentially, we could blind ourselves from patient-specific information using barcodes somehow. So I think a very exciting field, and RxSource is certainly exploring how we can push the boundaries with this QR and GS1 barcoding.
Great, thank you both. Just a reminder that attendees can ask questions, and we shall pick those up anonymously at the end of this session. Now, before we give the floor to Steve Rees, I wonder if you might just touch on what is an ever-frustrating area of translations and some of the cost savings that you've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. So when Steve first demoed Prism to me and told us about the translation database there, I went straight to the management team at RxSource and I said, we really need to add this in. I tried to think how many times during my career, how much money I've spent translating the phrase for clinical trial use only. And I think having translation tables is a no-brainer, really. It's a cost saver, an incredible cost and time saver for companies like RxSource. So now as soon as we get a phrase translated, we're adding it into our phrase table within Prism. And within a few months, I think we should have built up enough of a library that we're no longer, or at least less reliant on the need to outsource translations. Every time we outsource a translation, we're talking maybe 3 to 5 days to get that translated text back. And obviously there's a cost element as well. And I was trying to think, how much cost is there for translation of text? And I thought, if we consider a standard booklet label, we're translating into multiple different languages, the cost could easily spiral to around $2,000 or so a booklet label just for translation alone. So if we look at a phase 3 clinical trial, for example, where we've got an IMP, assuming there's a vial and a carton label for each that we're designing, and then a diluent such as sodium chloride thrown in as well, that's 5 components, that's $10,000 saved straight away there. So it's a massive cost saver for us, which obviously we pass directly on to the customer. And the other benefit as well with the software is that if there are any changes to the regulations as well, so let's say, like a silly example, but if we change for clinical trial use only, the regulators change it to only for clinical trial use, we can run a search on all of the labels that we've designed and printed to use that phrase and tell which ones very quickly are impacted within a matter of seconds, whereas previously we'd have to look at all of our hard copies of the labels to assess which are impacted, which could take days. So I really think that this is a key and again, a simple fix to a problem that has cost time and money in clinical trials.
Great, thanks, Rees. It's been fascinating to hear RxSource's experience. Steve, perhaps you can build on that and explain how Prism ID is supporting the market space.
Absolutely. We're very conscious that during this webinar, it's about allowing Rees and RxSource to talk about their experience. So what we see here is just basically 4 areas where Prism 360 clinical trial has been making a big impact. And I want to relate these back to what Rees has been saying. So the first one there, out of the box. We've heard how Rees and RxSource benefit from utilizing its pre-configured industry standard processes within the product. This really translates into speed of implementation, reduction in validation effort, and adoption of best practice. And we've heard how Rees and RxSource has leveraged this by getting to market being live, very, very quickly to meet their deadlines. This, to me, is one of the important things we offer now is very much an industry standard solution, which can be personalized and installed and commissioned and validated very, very quickly. So where we can, we advise our customers to go for an out-of-the-box solution, very, very cost-effective as well. The second area where you heard from Rees is the time it took him to actually get the solution up and running. And this is down to what we've done with our product here. We've looked at the traditional implementation model, an on-premise solution, how much time it takes to run your validation scripts, your IQ, OQs, and all the associated work underneath that. What we've done here now is we've built this SaaS cloud platform based on our best practice. It uses a lot of pre-configured modules. So our documents are pretty much off the shelf now because we're only offering a level of personalization rather than heavy configuration, which is not really required by the industry. And the upshot here is that because our product is out of the box and validation ready, it really means a short time from pressing the go button to be in a production ready status. And again, that's very important. And again, Reese has said that he had deadlines and Prism helped him achieve those deadlines. The last slide that Reese showed you was around language. Again, from my perspective, I'm shocked to see the same phrases being purchased and used over and over again in this industry. I'm quite shocked by it. So the use of a phrase library, a translation library, really has a lot of payback for anybody who wants to embrace that sort of technology. If you see common phrases, you use them over and over again. They're all version control. They're all proof of use. You have your full metadata behind those phrases. So you have your full traceability. So we believe that a phrase library, when built and maintained, has a real massive ROI for any of our users. It consistently reduces time to get these translations onto the label, onto the booklet. It reduces the cost, we've just heard, and the effort involved to do that. So a good translation library in your system is almost priceless. And the fourth area we see there is compliance. And we've already touched on that before about compliance. This is the heart of our product. It's GMP. We write the docs. We're very proud of our documentation. In our business, for every software developer, we have 2 teams working alongside them. So our documents are evolved alongside the product. So they're never disjointed. They're available as part of the solution, which you maintain as your implementation, and then you have the copies yourselves then for regulatory requirements. So those 4 items there mean any customer can really get up and running with a 360 system very, very quickly with a minimum risk and get the return on investment very, very quickly. So that's how we're supporting the market on that one. So the next slide really is a summary slide for now. And this I can actually sit down and read each of these lines to you, which I think is fairly pointless. And I'd like you to sort of read those while we'd, if it's okay with everybody else on the call here, move to the Q&A section. We can read the benefits quietly in the background, but the Q&A I think now are probably more important to the audience. There's some questions been asked. We can answer those questions, and you can read this slide in the background because I want to sort of get some interaction going now. So, moderator, Andy, any questions come in yet?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Steve. We've had a number of questions, and do please keep them coming. Reese, one for you first. I know you touched on it, but what are the key factors, do you think, when choosing a vendor?
Yeah, obviously in this case, we looked at a number of different vendors for us. One of the key considerations that we had to put in place was that they could install and train us remotely, given the current COVID situation. But more importantly for us, arguably more importantly, than our vendors, we try and view it as a partnership more than customer or vendor interaction. So we like to have a seamless interaction between our teams, and we look to find like-minded vendors that really share our drive and passion of always trying to improve, particularly specifically in the supply chain and overall patient experience. So when we first started talking to Prism about this software, they showed us the benefits of it, and started speaking to Steve, I could see that they've got a lot of the same values that we have at RxSource. And really, you heard how Steve talked about barcoding and the same passion that he shares that I do. So it was actually a very easy decision for us to make in the end.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Steve, talking about barcodes and about QR codes, which a lot of excitement around, could you explain a little bit more about their possible uses, and especially around that patient safety piece?
Okay, yeah, I think I mentioned it a little bit before on this one, but a QR code is today so easy to use. Most people have mobile phones. It's something we're used to every day, scanning things with a camera. So with that technology in most of our pockets, and even my mother, who's 85, she's quite apt with her own phone. So QR codes give access to a whole world of information in a very controlled way. So we see various companies which are related to the patient centricity, the usage of the drug in the field, looking at ways to really enhance what the patient experience is via the QR code. So by putting that QR code on the label at the start of the points, we can encrypt in that code the URL, additional information. That information can then be used to then launch features which the sponsor may require, or the independent company who's doing the field testing or pulling information from the patient. And it can be used for patient safety. If you've got someone who's slightly older or a little bit deaf, they could actually scan the barcode, the QR code. That could actually again make a lookup real time to the web portal, get the exact label which is on that product, and read it out aloud to them. It could also give additional sort of safety information. Are you sure that tablet you're taking is red? If it's not red, don't take it. So the use of the QR code as a launch site for additional services is something we are talking to more and more companies out there. There's no limits to what can be done. At the moment, it's outside the regulatory's control, but once these systems are built and are tested, seek regulatory consent to test them in the field, I see QR codes, barcodes, and sort of new technologies really shaking and changing the way we do clinical trials today. As Rich mentioned at the start of the presentation, we were looking at a 10-year timeline. Now, we've proven with the COVID vaccines that it can be reduced vastly, very, very quickly. And will customers expect a 10-year timeline in the future? No, they want to really move those timelines to shorter timelines to get the best benefit from those drugs. And technology is the way to do it. And barcodes and e-labels and all those sort of things will be helping our customers and our companies reach that goal. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, we've had a quick question about e-labels. What are they exactly, and are we already using them?
Well, again, e-labels is a generic term. We look at like iPhone, but there's something in SAP called iDoc. We use the word e-something quite loosely in our industries. So depending if you're clinical trials, if you're in pharma, med device, or somewhere else, the e-label has different connotations. And it could cover something as simple as an electronic output of the system. So it could be in the form of a PDF file, which can then be consumed. We've heard the word e-label used for an electronic version of that label, which is hosted in a portal. We even see extremes of the e-label in the form of a programmable e-ink label, which is a physical display, an LCD display, which is a static display on the product, which is programmed at source. So it takes the information at source, displays it on its information, and it can be rewritten in the field. It's a bit like those Kindle readers, which have the grey and black text on them. Don't require a battery. They're powered up. They're written to. They hold the image, and off they go into the field. So if you need to rewrite your expiry date, for example, it's not a case of physically changing the label. It's just reflash, reprogram the actual e-ink label. So the e-label covers quite a multitude, including the NFC and RFID labels, which have the chips incorporated in the physical label, which allows you to read that chip using your smartphone or an RFID reader. Again, that's another form of e-label. So there's several forms, but what we're seeing is all these sort of e-label things are being tested on limited trial, general adoption. And as they are being tested and in limited trials, their success will be fed back. And if they are good, if they do bring benefits, they'll be adopted. So just like the adoption of GS1 18 months ago, we will see that the e-label and what it actually means in clinical trials will be evolved, it'll be controlled, it'll be documented, and I see that being adopted in the future years as something which is going to be eventually mandatory. So at the moment, it's a general term, but there's a lot of work taking place to make the e-labels a part of what we do daily.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Steve. Reese, we've got a great question here on trial adherence. And our attendee was wondering, what is the impact of patients falling off a study?
Yeah, well, huge, massive impact. So patient adherence, or well, actually non-adherence, is one of the biggest factors that leads to increasing cost and length of clinical trials. But it's not just a huge impact to clinical trials alone, but I think you see it from a commercial perspective across the board. So regularly reading on the news about bacterial resistance, and that's due in part to patients not adhering to the full cycle of their antibiotic dose. Rather, they stop taking the drug as soon as they're feeling a little bit better. So that's having a huge impact there. But going back to clinical trials, there's a lot of literature around patient adherence, and it's really at the forefront of, as I mentioned earlier, sponsor companies and companies like RxSource's thinking. It's really not uncommon to hear 40% of patients dropping off a clinical study. And really worryingly, this can increase up to about 70% or so with studies that have complex dosing or studies where dietary requirements have to change and the patient feels uncomfortable. So if we consider the average cost of a phase 3 clinical trial to be somewhere around $20 million, when you factor in the cost of drug for the patient, services, delivery, the cost of setting up the clinical sites, etc., it's very clear to see that non-adherence is costing pharma companies multi-millions of pounds in each trial. Of course, as soon as a patient drops out of a study, additional patients often have to be recruited then to ensure the study is going to meet the statistical significance to be able to move to the next phase. But looking at it from a patient perspective as well, obviously there's a huge impact on the patient. As I said earlier, they've got enough on their mind. These are often very sick patients. So the last thing that they need is to be confused by their dosing regimen. If, for example, they mix up their dosing, they may have to be withdrawn from that study. And then they've got a difficult task of trying to still get hold of that medicine, particularly if they're feeling a benefit from it. So really, it needs to be the forefront of everybody working in clinical trials. They need to be thinking, how do we make this easier for the patient? Anything that we can do to improve patient adherence is going to benefit all parties. And we're seeing that already with implementation of direct-to-patient now, where it was already being mooted before COVID, and some logistics companies were trialing how do we get the drug delivered directly to the patient's address. In cases where it's refrigerated, for example, do we provide those patients with a refrigerator so we know it's keeping the drug specifically at that temperature? But since COVID and patients becoming less and less willing to travel to go to the clinical sites, it's becoming more commonly used direct to patient, and the regulators are really providing quite clear guidelines now as to what needs to be followed in terms of direct to patient to ensure that companies like RxSource who offer it are completely compliant. So yeah, again, the impact is absolutely massive, and using some of these technologies that we've talked about today, I think can have a really, really big impact on trying to improve patient adherence and getting them to stay on a clinical trial.
Great, thank you. Reese, I've got another question for you here. You talked about benefits around flexibility and around cost, but have there been any unexpected benefits for your customers?
Yeah, I think, obviously benefit, the key ones we've seen are around flexibility, costs, saving timelines. But Having the ability to improve our local sourcing option, I think, has been a benefit that we didn't perhaps anticipate initially. And then we've obviously been able to pass that on to some of our existing customers and be more competitive in our pricing for them. And the whole point that I mentioned about the randomization as well, actually at the time when we were installing Prism, we were in talks with a statistical group and going back and forth and changing the randomization list. And as soon as we got the training and the demonstration on how easy it was to map everything for importation of randomization, I could go straight back to the statistical group and say, we can accept this. This is fine. We can work with it. So that's been a big benefit for us and for our customers. Obviously, this is still fairly new for us. We installed it within the last 3 months or so, 4 months. But we're already starting to work behind the scenes on some exciting additional services that we'll be looking to roll out soon that we really think will massively benefit our patients and our customers. And furthermore, we've not had a chance yet to trial it with the returns and destruction piece at the end of a clinical trial, but I'm sure there are massive benefits as well that we'll be able to experience once we get the opportunity there with that. So, in summary, there's been multiple benefits with, I think, a lot more to come.
Great. Steve, a 5-week onboarding for RxSource, that's really impressive. And I wonder if some of our listeners might struggle to even get a meeting in other people's diaries in that time. Is that a typical time frame?
It's indicative timeline, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks. It's down to what the customer wants. RxSource had a deadline, and that deadline helped both parties focus on what's required. So what we did with it, RxSource was good because they were insourcing, which means there was no legacy system to replace or set ways of working. And they could embrace our best practice and leverage our pre-configured blueprint processes. That meant that what RxSource wanted, we could do out of the box. That really helped the timelines. They also made key staff available, so we were not working in isolation. We had a lot of exchanges of requests, requirements, feedback loops, documentation to drive us to personalize the solution to meet Reese's team's needs. So 5 weeks, 6 weeks, that can be done, especially where you're embracing the blueprints, the out-of-the-box solution. I must say that is on a SaaS platform, because that's where the industry is going generally now. And if you go into a SaaS platform, you can then remove a lot of the IT costs and IT delay in terms of provisioning servers and doing the testing of those servers. We avoided having expensive configurations. We went down the personalization route on that one. And by having the best practice out-of-the-box solution, we avoided the need of authoring bespoke documentation as well. So the application that RxSource purchased can be replicated, and can be replicated in those sort of timelines, providing that the customer wants to work with Prism to get the best solution in those timelines. We have other customers who want to sort of have a more tailored solution, which we can also adopt to. But we're finding more and more of these best practice, blueprinted, out-of-the-box solutions on SaaS is where the industry is going for now. So again, I hope that answers the question. 5, 6, 7 weeks is quite typical now.
Great, okay. We talked about cost savings in terms of translations and phrase management, but are there any other bigger picture savings, for example, around having this future-proof system?
Oh, you've got 2 more hours. I've got loads for you.
Yeah.
Well, let's look at, first of all, this is a cloud-based system. It has workflow, it has remote user login to it. It's got the full audit log built in. So where you have a very extensive audit log and workflow and other tools, do you need to have paper-based systems? So I think, Reece, from your perspective there, you've virtually removed a lot of your paper-based systems out of your clinical trial labeling system. So if you're removing paper, you're removing risk. You're removing how much time do our customers spend preparing for an external audit? I've seen rooms stacked high of paper documents. There's 2 people spending 3 or 4 weeks preparing for an audit. In the audit log in 360, it's all there. So there's a massive saving. Removing paper-based systems and the risk associated, massive savings again. We have the modular solution. So going back to your future-proofing statement there, it's modular. We have a whole range of modules which bolt onto the core platform to give you additional features and functions. We have off-the-shelf now integrated label vision inspection module. We have a regulatory rules engine to decide if the label content is right per country. We have an InDesign plugin module which allows you to share that approved data with other parts of your business. If you're producing commercial artwork as well as your clinical trials, that same data pool can be used there. So as we're a modular-based system, and we've done to remove paper-based systems, we're very much a future-proof solution which can be expanded. To date, our smallest customer with Prism 360 is single site, one workstation, and our biggest now is over 500 workstations, over 20 odd countries. So the solution can be expanded based on the customer's needs. So future-proofing is built in. Error elimination, human error elimination are core to the product. Validation compliance are core to the product. Removal of paper is, again, core to the product. So I'm happy to talk for hours on cost savings for the smallest change, the big impact of having no paper-based systems. But overall, the product will give you savings in time, efforts, and be there as a long-term solution for you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, we do only have a few more minutes left, I'm afraid. So, Steve, and maybe Reece, do you think you could sum up, and if I invite you to paint a picture of what the next few years might look like in terms of the capabilities offered by cloud-based systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the clinical trial industry is very tightly regulated, as it needs to be and should be. And perhaps historically there's maybe been a little apprehension over changing processes, particularly when it comes to embracing technologies. And we've seen various regulations added that one could argue is maybe a backward step in embracing technology. But over the last few years in particular, I think we're starting to see a change in how technology is now being used. I talked earlier about the Falsified Medicines Directive. It's really embracing technology to ensure that any medicines that are provided commercially are not counterfeit and are genuine. And we've touched on various exciting ways that technology is being used in the pipeline. Things like the work that Faubel is doing on e-labels, working closely with the regulators and clinical trial groups to use those labels to manage the expiry date. So it's really cloud-based systems that are key to driving these improvements, and particularly more so in the environment that we're finding ourselves in right now. Obviously, once the pandemic is under control, in sort of June, July time, I don't see everybody rushing back to the office straight away. There's going to be people who still want to work remotely or almost like a hybrid approach. And in order to work successfully from home, I think cloud-based software is absolutely key to that. Yeah, Steve, any thoughts on your end?
Well, I'm for sort of more the Prism end of it, but what I'm seeing there is really supports what you're saying there is we're seeing pre-pandemic to post-pandemic a big shift from customers wanting on-premise solutions to cloud SaaS-based solutions. That's been a major shift. Customers still want the best software out there. They still want to invest. And with the way we are now decentralized, and you've mentioned it before, how your team have been in different locations but still using the same platform. Designing labels from home, designing labels from in the US or in Canada. It's about that cloud collaboration now. So we're seeing a big move to SaaS. We're seeing more requests and design for simplification. People do not want to have bespoke solutions anymore. They want to have something which is simple to use, effective. We're seeing the adoption in the industry of more and more common workflows and print processes. So customers saying, well, I work this certain way, but if I make a slight change, I can adopt this off-the-shelf, pre-validated, pre-configured print process for Prism. With a small change in my process, I can actually make a big difference to the way I work. So we're seeing simplification, standardization. We spoke about the QR codes and what they can do. We're seeing adoption of new technologies. We're seeing Adoption of colour inkjet printing in our industry now, where before we're pretty extensively using Zebra printers, black image on white background. We're seeing more and more colour printers coming in there. Not so much in the clinical trials where it's a very standard label, but on the peripheral, personalised and packaging, med device, pharma, etc. We're seeing modularity where the software, a core product goes in, and additional modules are then purchased based on customers' needs and business needs. And overall, I think the last word here is about sharing. We're seeing more collaboration taking place. And I think with the cloud-based system, potentially sponsors can log into a 360 system owned by another third party and approve electronically. We can remove those external emails in terms of approving entities and translations, etc. So again, we see more and more sharing of that single platform with your customers and with your sponsors to give a better holistic view, better metadata in terms of where we're up to in the job, dashboards, etc. So simplicity, standardization, and sharing is sort of drivers in the industry. So that's my sort of observations.
Great, thank you, Steve. Well, I'm really sorry, our time together is up now, and I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of the many questions we received, including a few that are just popping in the box now. However, we will send a write-up of the session covering those questions in the next few days. In the meantime, do please visit the Prism ID website and follow Prism ID on LinkedIn for all of the latest updates. So all that's left is to thank our speakers. It was fascinating to hear your experience from the coalface, so very many thanks, Rhys and Steve. And thank you all for joining. I hope we can have your company again soon.